Chapter 1. The Threat of Nebuchadnezzar. In the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians, he ruled over a great empire in the city of Nineveh. His power stretched across many lands, and he sought to make his kingdom even greater. But there were nations that refused to bow to him, and this made Nebuchadnezzar furious. He declared war on all who would not serve him. Nebuchadnezzar sent messengers to the lands of the west, calling on them to join him in his battle against a powerful enemy called Arphaxad, the king of the Medes. But the people in the west ignored Nebuchadnezzar's command. They did not take him seriously, and they refused to help him. This insult only added to Nebuchadnezzar's anger, and he swore to punish them when his war with Arphaxad was over. Nebuchadnezzar gathered his armies, and they fought a great battle against Arphaxad. The Lord allowed Nebuchadnezzar to conquer Arphaxad and destroy the cities of the Medes. The army of Nebuchadnezzar marched across the land, leaving ruins in their wake. Nebuchadnezzar, now victorious, returned to Nineveh and celebrated his triumph with a grand feast that lasted many days. After the celebrations ended, Nebuchadnezzar turned his attention to the nations that had defied him. He remembered how they had mocked him and refused to join his cause. He called together his generals and officers and said, "I will take revenge on these ungrateful nations. I will send my armies to destroy them and make them bow before me. None will escape my wrath." Nebuchadnezzar appointed Holofernes, his chief general, to lead the campaign. Holofernes was a ruthless and powerful warrior, feared by all who faced him in battle. Nebuchadnezzar commanded him to gather a vast army, numbering over 120,000 soldiers and 12,000 horsemen. He ordered Holofernes to destroy every land that had refused his command and to spare no one. Holofernes obeyed the king and set out with his massive army. They carried with them weapons, supplies, and the strength of Nebuchadnezzar's authority. As they marched from city to city, fear spread across the lands. No one dared to stand against them. Holofernes burned villages, plundered cities, and left nothing behind but ashes. The nations of the west, hearing of Holofernes' approach, were terrified. They knew they could not stand against such a mighty force. Some of them tried to make peace by sending messengers to Holofernes with gifts and promises of loyalty. Holofernes accepted their submission, but warned them to remember that they now served Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the whole earth. But there were still those who refused to bow. Among them were the people of Israel, who lived in the hill country near Jerusalem. They worshipped the one true God and refused to serve any earthly king, especially one as proud and wicked as Nebuchadnezzar. The Israelites trusted in God to protect them, even as they heard of the destruction left in Holofernes' wake. Holofernes continued his campaign, growing more arrogant with each victory. He began to believe that no god could stand against him, and he mocked the faith of those who trusted in their gods. "Let me see if their gods can save them," he said, as he ordered the destruction of their temples and the slaughter of their priests. When Holofernes reached the borders of Israel, he learned about the people who lived there. He heard that they worshipped a God who had delivered them from Egypt and helped them conquer their enemies in the past. This intrigued Holofernes, and he asked his officers to tell him more about these people and their God. One of his officers explained, "The Israelites are a peculiar people. They worship a God who they say created the heavens and the earth. They follow strict laws and refuse to worship idols or other gods. Their God has protected them in the past, but if they sin against him, he allows their enemies to defeat them. If we can make them turn away from their God, we will be able to conquer them easily." Holofernes listened carefully and devised a plan. He decided to target the city of Bethulia, a small town that guarded the mountain pass leading to Jerusalem. If Bethulia fell, the rest of Israel would be defenseless. Holofernes believed this would be the key to crushing the Israelites and proving that their God could not save them. The people of Bethulia heard about the approach of Holofernes and his army. They knew they were vastly outnumbered, but they refused to surrender. They placed their trust in God and prepared for a siege. The leaders of Bethulia called the people together and urged them to remain faithful and courageous. They reminded them of how God had delivered their ancestors from mighty armies and assured them that he would do it again. Holofernes arrived at Bethulia and surrounded the city, cutting off its water supply. He believed the people would soon give up and surrender. Days turned into weeks, and the people of Bethulia began to grow weak from thirst. Their faith was tested, and some began to doubt. They pleaded with their leaders to surrender before it was too late. The leaders of Bethulia, though discouraged, turned to God in prayer. They cried out for his mercy and deliverance, asking him to show his power and save his people. They asked for a sign to strengthen their faith and give them hope in the face of overwhelming odds. Meanwhile, Holofernes waited, confident that the people of Bethulia would soon break under the pressure. He boasted to his officers about how easily he would defeat the Israelites and bring glory to Nebuchadnezzar. But what Holofernes did not realize was that God was already preparing a way to deliver his people. Though the situation seemed hopeless, the people of Bethulia did not know that their cries had reached heaven. God had heard their prayers and was about to use an unexpected hero to bring about their salvation. The story of how God would deliver his people was just beginning to unfold. Chapter 2. Siege of Bethulia. Holofernes and his great army surrounded the city of Bethulia. This small town stood in a critical spot, guarding the mountain pass that led into the land of Israel. If Bethulia fell, the way to Jerusalem and the heart of Israel would be open for Holofernes and his soldiers to destroy. The people of Bethulia knew what was at stake. Their town was the last line of defense, and they could not allow it to fall. The leaders of the city gathered together and strengthened the gates, prepared their weapons, and stationed guards on the walls. They prayed to God for strength and courage, knowing that they could not defeat such a large army on their own. Holofernes was confident that the city would soon surrender. He sent scouts to block off the water springs outside the town. Without water, he believed the people of Bethulia would grow weak and give up. Holofernes waited as his soldiers camped around the city, cutting off supplies and preparing to attack. Inside Bethulia, the people began to feel the effects of the siege. Days passed, and the lack of water made life unbearable. The children cried from thirst, and the animals began to die. The people gathered around their leaders, Isaiah and the elders, begging them to surrender to Holofernes. They said, "God has abandoned us. We cannot hold out much longer. It would be better to surrender and live than to die of thirst. Give us over to Holofernes, and perhaps he will have mercy on us." The leaders of Bethulia were deeply troubled. They did not want to surrender, but they also could not bear to see their people suffer. Isaiah spoke to the crowd, trying to encourage them to trust in God. He said, "Be patient, my brothers and sisters. Let us wait 5 more days. If God does not send help within that time, then we will surrender to the enemy. But until then, we must not lose hope." The people agreed to wait 5 days, though their hearts were heavy with fear and doubt. Many of them wondered if God had truly abandoned them, but they had no other choice but to hold on a little longer. As the days passed, the suffering in Bethulia grew worse. The people prayed for a miracle, but they saw no sign of deliverance. Holofernes, meanwhile, grew more confident. He believed that his strategy was working and that the city would soon fall into his hands. Holofernes' officers came to him and said, "Why do we waste time waiting? Let us attack Bethulia now and crush them. Their God cannot save them, and they are too weak to fight." But Holofernes replied, "No, we will not attack yet. Let the people of Bethulia suffer. When they can endure no more, they will come out of their city and beg for mercy. Then we will take them as our slaves, and their God will be shown to be powerless." Holofernes' plan seemed unstoppable. His army was vast, his camp was strong, and the people of Bethulia were on the verge of giving up. The leaders of Bethulia did not know what to do. They gathered together and prayed once more, asking God for wisdom and guidance. Though the situation seemed hopeless, God had not forgotten his people. He had heard their prayers and was preparing an answer. Deliverance would come in a way that no one expected, through a woman of great faith and courage. The siege of Bethulia was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of a great victory that would show the power of God and the strength of those who trust in him. As Holofernes' army encircled the city of Bethulia, the tension inside the city walls grew each day. The people could see the vast army camped in the valleys below, their banners waving in the wind and their weapons glinting in the sunlight. Soldiers kept watch from the walls, counting the thousands of tents and hearing the distant sound of Holofernes' army sharpening their swords and preparing for war. The sight of such overwhelming strength filled the hearts of Bethulia's people with dread. The city's water supply was the greatest challenge. Holofernes' soldiers had blocked the springs outside Bethulia, and soon the wells inside the city began to run dry. Each day, the women who normally went to draw water returned with empty vessels, their faces weary and strained. Without water, it became impossible to prepare food or care for the sick. Thirst gripped the people like a cruel enemy, weakening their bodies and breaking their spirits. In the streets, children cried for water. Mothers, desperate to soothe their little ones, gave them small drops from their own portions, though they had barely enough for themselves. The men of the city, who had been strong and determined in the beginning, now sat in silence, their lips cracked and their skin dry from the lack of water. The elders, too, began to despair, questioning how long they could endure. The leaders of Bethulia worked tirelessly to maintain order. Isaiah and the other elders moved through the city, encouraging the people to hold on and trust in God. They reminded them of God's past deliverances, recounting the stories of Moses parting the Red Sea and Joshua leading the Israelites into the Promised Land. Our God is the same today as he was then, Isaiah told them. He has not abandoned us. He will come to our aid. Despite these words, fear spread like wildfire among the people. In secret gatherings, some began to grumble and doubt. What kind of God would let his people suffer like this? They whispered to one another. Perhaps we are being punished. Perhaps Holofernes is right, and our God is powerless against him. Others, overcome by fear, suggested surrendering immediately. At least if we give ourselves up, we will live, they argued. Better to be slaves than to die of thirst in our own city. These words caused division among the people, and arguments broke out in the streets. Families debated what to do, torn between faith in God and the desperate reality of their suffering. Holofernes, observing the city from his camp, was pleased with the reports from his scouts. His plan was working perfectly. Each day that the water supply remained blocked, the people of Bethulia grew weaker and more desperate. His officers came to him with updates, saying, "The city's strength is failing. Soon, they will have no choice but to surrender." In his pride, Holofernes believed that victory was certain. "Let them break themselves with their own fear and thirst," he said. "When they are too weak to resist, we will take the city without lifting a sword. Their God will be proven worthless, and they will know that Nebuchadnezzar rules the earth." Meanwhile, inside the walls of Bethulia, the spiritual battle raged just as fiercely as the physical one. The people of Bethulia prayed constantly, though some began to feel that their prayers were unanswered. The synagogue was filled with those who cried out to God, asking for a sign, for rain, or for anything that would give them hope. The priests reminded the people of their covenant with God, urging them to repent of any sins that might have brought this trial upon them. They called for fasting and offered sacrifices, asking God to turn his face toward his people and deliver them from their enemies. These moments of worship gave the people brief moments of strength, but as the days dragged on, even the strongest began to feel their faith waver. On the 5th day of the siege, the leaders of Bethulia gathered in the city square to hear the cries of the people. Men, women, and children surrounded them, their voices filled with desperation. One man, older and gaunt from thirst, stepped forward and spoke for the crowd. "Leaders of Bethulia," he said, "how much longer must we endure? Do you not see our children dying of thirst? Our livestock is dead, and soon we will follow. If you do not surrender to Holofernes, there will be nothing left of us." The crowd murmured in agreement, their weak voices rising together in a plea for mercy. Some began to shout angrily at the elders, accusing them of pride and stubbornness. "You are willing to let us all die because you refuse to bow to Holofernes, they cried. "Is this what God wants? For his people to perish in their own city?" Uzziah stood before them, his heart heavy with the burden of leadership. He understood their suffering, for he too had gone without water and had seen the pain in his own family's eyes. But he also knew that surrendering to Holofernes would mean abandoning their faith and submitting to a king who mocked their God. "Brothers and sisters," Uzziah said, raising his voice so all could hear, "I understand your pain. I feel it too. But we must not forget who we are. We are the people of the living God, the God who delivered our ancestors from slavery in Egypt and gave us this land as our inheritance. If we surrender now, we are saying that we no longer trust him to save us. Is that what you want?" The people listened in silence, their anger fading into uncertainty. Uzziah continued, "I will ask you to wait just a little longer. Let us give God 5 more days to deliver us. If no help comes by then, we will do as you ask and surrender. But for now, let us not give up hope. Let us trust that God will hear our cries and come to our aid." The crowd murmured among themselves, and at last they agreed to Uzziah's plan. They would wait 5 more days, though many doubted that anything would change. As the people returned to their homes, Uzziah and the elders gathered together to pray once more. They knelt before God, pouring out their hearts and asking for his intervention. In the camp of Holofernes, the soldiers celebrated their growing victory. They drank and feasted, boasting about how easily they would take Bethulia. Some mocked the Israelites, calling their faith foolish and weak. "Where is their God now?" they laughed. "Let him save them if he can." But in the quiet moments of the night, as Bethulia's people cried out to heaven, God was listening. Though the city appeared to be on the brink of collapse, he had not forgotten his people. He was preparing an answer to their prayers, one that would come in a way no one expected. The people of Bethulia could not yet see it, but their deliverance was near. God's plan was unfolding, and through the faith and courage of one woman, the city would soon be saved. Chapter 3. Judith's Plan. As the people of Bethulia waited for God's deliverance, the days passed with no sign of relief. The city remained surrounded, its people weak and thirsty, and their spirits sinking into despair. The promise of 5 days had given them a faint glimmer of hope, but even that began to fade as the hours dragged on. Many believed that they would soon be forced to surrender to Holofernes and his great army. In the midst of this darkness, there lived a woman named Judith. She was a widow, a woman of great beauty, wisdom, and unwavering faith in God. Judith had lived a life of devotion, fasting and praying regularly, even after her husband had died many years earlier. She was deeply respected by the people of Bethulia for her righteousness and her understanding of God's law. When Judith heard the cries of her people and saw their despair, she felt a fire burn within her. She could not stand by while they lost their faith in God. She knew that God had the power to save them, but she also understood that his deliverance often came through the actions of those who trusted him. Judith believed that it was time to act. She sent for the leaders of the city, including Uzziah and the elders, and invited them to her home. When they arrived, she greeted them humbly and then spoke with boldness. Her voice was steady and full of conviction as she addressed them. "Listen to me," Judith said. "You have done wrong by testing God. You have set a time limit for his deliverance, saying that if he does not save us within 5 days, we will surrender to our enemies. Who are we to put God to the test? Do we not trust him to act in his own time and in his own way? God is not bound by our demands. He is the Almighty, and he will save us when the moment is right." The elders listened in silence, ashamed of their lack of faith. Judith continued, her voice firm yet full of hope. "My brothers, I have a plan. God has placed it in my heart, and I believe it will bring deliverance to our people. But you must trust me and allow me to carry it out. Do not ask me what I will do, for I cannot reveal it now. But know this, God will use me to bring down our enemies, and through his power, Bethulia will be saved." Uzziah and the elders were amazed at Judith's courage and faith. Though they did not know what she intended to do, they saw the determination in her eyes and felt the strength of her words. Isaiah spoke on behalf of the group, saying, "Do as you have said, for we trust that God is with you. May He guide your steps and give you success in all that you do." That night, Judith prepared herself for her mission. She bathed, anointed herself with oil, and dressed in her finest garments. She wore a beautiful robe, adorned herself with jewelry, and braided her hair. Though she looked like a queen, her heart remained humble, and her mind was focused on the task ahead. Judith did not rely on her beauty alone, but on the strength and guidance of God. As the sun set, Judith called her maid and gathered the provisions she would need for her journey. She took food, wine, and a few simple supplies, trusting that God would provide the rest. Before leaving, she knelt in prayer, asking God to protect her and give her the wisdom to fulfill His plan. She prayed not for her own safety, but for the salvation of her people and the glory of God's name. With her maid by her side, Judith left the city under the cover of darkness. The guards at the gate watched in astonishment as she passed through, but they did not stop her. They knew that she was a woman of great faith and trusted that God was leading her. Judith walked boldly toward the enemy camp, her steps guided by her unwavering trust in the Lord. When Judith reached the outskirts of Holofernes' camp, she was stopped by the enemy guards. They were immediately struck by her beauty and her calm demeanor. Judith spoke to them with confidence, saying, "I am a daughter of the Hebrews, but I have left my people because they are doomed. I have important information for your commander, Holofernes, and I wish to help him defeat my people." The guards, eager to please their commander, quickly brought Judith to Holofernes. As she entered his tent, Holofernes was stunned by her beauty and grace. He welcomed her warmly, thinking that she had come to betray her people out of fear. Judith bowed before him and spoke humbly, yet with great wisdom. "My lord," she said, "the Israelites have sinned against their God, and now He has abandoned them. They are weak, and they cannot hold out much longer. I have come to tell you how you can defeat them without losing a single soldier. But first I ask that you let me stay in your camp. Each night I will go out to pray, and God will reveal to me when the time is right for you to attack." Holofernes was pleased with Judith's words and believed her completely. He saw no reason to doubt her, for her beauty and sincerity seemed to confirm her loyalty. He ordered his servants to treat Judith with great respect and to give her whatever she needed. Judith remained in the camp, moving freely and observing everything around her. Each night, Judith left the camp to pray, as she had said she would. But in her prayers, she did not seek the destruction of her people. Instead, she called upon God to give her the strength and wisdom to defeat Holofernes and save Bethulia. She trusted that God was with her and that He would guide her at the right moment. Holofernes, meanwhile, grew more and more captivated by Judith. He believed that her arrival was a sign of his inevitable victory and that the Israelites were doomed. His pride and arrogance blinded him to the truth that God was using Judith to bring about his downfall. Judith waited patiently, knowing that the time was near. She observed the routines of the camp, the movements of the soldiers, and the weaknesses in their defenses. She trusted that God would open the door for her to act, and she remained steadfast in her faith. As the days passed, Holofernes grew eager to celebrate his victory in advance. He planned a great feast and invited Judith to join him. Judith agreed, knowing that this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. She prepared herself once more, dressing in her finest garments and praying for God's strength. At the feast, Holofernes drank heavily, boasting about his power and the certainty of his triumph. Judith remained calm and composed, watching as he grew more and more intoxicated. When the feast ended, Holofernes was taken to his tent, where he collapsed in a drunken stupor. Judith knew that the moment had come. With her maid keeping watch outside, she entered Holofernes' tent. She stood over him as he lay helpless, his weapons by his side, but useless in his drunken state. Judith prayed silently, asking God to give her the strength to do what needed to be done. Taking Holofernes' sword, Judith lifted it high and brought it down with all her might. She struck him twice, severing his head from his body. Blood stained her hands and garments, but Judith did not hesitate or falter. She wrapped the head in a cloth and handed it to her maid. Together, they left the tent and returned to Bethulia under the cover of night. Judith's plan had succeeded. God had delivered Holofernes into her hands, and the power of the enemy was broken. Though the battle was not yet over, the tide had turned, and the deliverance of Bethulia was now certain. God had answered the prayers of his people through the courage and faith of Judith. Chapter 4. Judith's Deception. Judith, guided by her faith and trust in God, continued her mission in the camp of Holofernes. She had gained the confidence of the Assyrians, and her beauty and wisdom kept her safe in the enemy's midst. Judith was careful with her words and actions, knowing that every step she took was vital to the survival of Bethulia. Though she appeared calm and composed, her heart was always lifted in prayer, seeking God's guidance in all that she did. Each day, Judith moved freely around the camp, always under the watchful eye of the Assyrian soldiers. They admired her grace and beauty and believed her to be loyal to their cause. Judith took this time to observe everything in the camp. She noted the movements of the soldiers, the layout of their tents, and the location of their supplies. Every detail she learned would be crucial for the deliverance of her people. Holofernes, the Assyrian general, had grown completely captivated by Judith. He saw her as a sign of his power and victory, a trophy of his success. In his arrogance, he never doubted her loyalty to him or questioned her motives. He admired her wisdom and beauty, and he believed that she would help him crush the Israelites. Judith used his pride against him, speaking with humility and showing no sign of fear. Judith spoke to Holofernes about the Israelites, presenting herself as someone who had abandoned her people. She told him that the Israelites were weak and that their God had turned against them because of their sins. Her words flattered Holofernes, confirming what he wanted to believe, that his army was invincible and that the God of the Israelites could not save them. "My lord," Judith said, "the Israelites are now vulnerable. Their supplies are gone, and their water has run out. They are preparing to surrender, but they still believe their God will save them. If you wait too long to attack, their God may deliver them, and your victory will be lost. But if you strike at the right moment, when their sins have angered their God the most, you will destroy them completely." Holofernes listened carefully to Judith's words. He believed her insight was divine, a gift that would ensure his triumph. Judith's calm and confident manner reassured him that her intentions were genuine. He allowed her to stay in the camp and treated her with great honor, believing that she would guide him to victory. Each night, Judith left the camp to pray in the valley. She told the guards that she was seeking guidance from her God and that he would reveal the perfect time for Holofernes to attack. The guards allowed her to go freely, trusting her completely. In truth, Judith used this time to draw strength from God and to prepare herself for the task ahead. She prayed earnestly, asking God to give her courage and wisdom to deliver her people. The soldiers in the camp grew accustomed to Judith's presence. They admired her and spoke of her with respect. To them, she seemed like a gift sent by the gods, a woman of unmatched beauty and wisdom who had chosen to stand with their commander. They were unaware that Judith's heart remained with her people and that every step she took was part of God's plan to bring down their army. As Judith spent more time in the camp, she continued to build Holofernes' trust. She spoke to him with humility and respect, praising his strength and leadership. Her words fed his pride, and he grew more confident in his belief that victory was within his grasp. Judith's beauty and wisdom blinded him to the truth, that she was working against him, not for him. Holofernes decided to hold a feast in honor of Judith. He wanted to celebrate her arrival in his camp and show his soldiers that she was now part of their cause. He invited all his officers and prepared a grand banquet filled with food and wine. Holofernes intended to impress Judith and to draw her closer to him, believing that she was the key to his ultimate victory. Judith accepted the invitation with grace, knowing that this was the moment she had been waiting for. She prepared herself carefully, dressing in her finest garments and adorning herself with jewelry. She prayed once more, asking God to give her strength and to guide her actions. Judith knew that this feast would determine the fate of her people. At the banquet, Holofernes sat at the head of the table, surrounded by his officers. Judith was given a place of honor beside him, and all eyes were on her as she entered the room. Her beauty and poise captivated everyone present, and the soldiers whispered among themselves, praising her elegance and charm. Holofernes, overcome with pride and desire, drank heavily throughout the feast. He boasted about his power and the greatness of his army, speaking of how easily he would destroy the Israelites. His officers joined in his laughter, raising their cups in celebration. Judith remained calm and composed, watching as Holofernes grew more and more intoxicated. When the feast came to an end, Holofernes ordered his servants to prepare his tent for him and Judith. He intended to spend the night with her, confident that she would willingly join him. Judith, however, had no intention of letting him carry out his plans. She followed him to his tent, her heart steady and her mind focused on what needed to be done. Inside the tent, Holofernes collapsed onto his bed, completely overcome by the wine he had consumed. He was unable to defend himself, his strength and pride rendered useless by his own indulgence. Judith stood over him, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to act. She knew that this was the moment God had prepared her for, the moment when she would strike a blow against the enemy and save her people. Judith prayed silently, asking God to give her the courage and strength to do what needed to be done. She reached for Holofernes' sword, which hung by his side, and lifted it with both hands. With one swift and powerful strike, she brought the sword down upon his neck, severing his head from his body. Blood spilled onto the floor, but Judith remained calm and determined. She wrapped Holofernes' head in a cloth and handed it to her maid, who had been waiting outside the tent. Together, they left the camp under the cover of darkness, carrying the gruesome trophy that would signal the end of the siege. The guards, who believed Judith was simply going out to pray as she had done before, did not stop her. Judith and her maid returned to Bethulia before dawn. When they arrived, the people of the city were astonished to see them. Judith called for the leaders of the city and showed them Holofernes' head. The sight of it filled them with amazement and joy, for they knew that God had delivered them through Judith's courage and faith. Judith spoke to the people, saying, "Praise God, for he has delivered our enemy into my hands. Holofernes is dead, and his army will soon fall. Let us give thanks to the Lord, for he has heard our prayers and saved his people." The people of Bethulia erupted in celebration, praising God for his mercy and faithfulness. They prepared themselves for battle, knowing that the Assyrian army, now leaderless and in disarray, would soon be defeated. Judith's deception had brought about the deliverance of her people, and her faith in God had been. Chapter 5. The Fall of Holofernes. As the dawn broke over Bethulia, Judith and her maid stood at the city gates, the severed head of Holofernes hidden within a bag. The leaders of the city quickly gathered, called by Judith to witness what the Lord had done. She revealed the gruesome trophy, lifting Holofernes' head for all to see. The sight of it left the leaders and the people in awe. Judith spoke boldly, her voice filled with conviction and faith. "Praise the Lord our God," she said, "for he has not abandoned his people in their time of need. By his hand, I was able to defeat Holofernes. The enemy's strength is shattered, and their leader lies dead. Take courage now, for the Lord will give us victory over our enemies." The city erupted in praise and thanksgiving to God. The people, who had been weak and afraid, were now filled with renewed strength and confidence. The leaders of Bethulia gathered the people and gave instructions to prepare for battle. Though they would soon march against the enemy, they knew the hardest blow had already been struck. Judith continued, explaining what they must do. "Send messengers to the surrounding towns and villages. Let the Israelites know that the Lord has delivered Holofernes into our hands. Gather all the fighting men and prepare to pursue the Assyrians. At dawn, attack their camp. You will find them weak and scattered, for their leader is gone, and fear will consume them." The leaders followed her advice without question, for they saw that the hand of God was with her. Messengers were sent out, and soon the Israelites from nearby cities joined the people of Bethulia, prepared to strike against the Assyrian army. Meanwhile, In the Assyrian camp, the soldiers remained unaware of the fate of their commander. Holofernes' officers waited for his orders, confident that the siege of Bethulia was nearing its end. They assumed Judith was still with him in his tent, and no one dared disturb their general. As the sun began to rise, Holofernes' officers finally approached his tent. They expected to find him resting after the night's feast, but when they entered, they were met with horror. There lay Holofernes' lifeless body, his head severed from his neck, and blood staining the bed. For a moment, they were frozen in disbelief. Then, panic swept over them. "Judith," they cried, "the woman has betrayed us." The officers ran through the camp, shouting the news. The soldiers, who had been so confident of their victory, were struck with fear and confusion. Without their leader, they did not know what to do. Their trust in Judith had blinded them, and now their arrogance had led to their downfall. At that very moment, the Israelites launched their attack. The gates of Bethulia swung open, and the people charged out, shouting praises to God. They were joined by the men from the surrounding cities, creating a united army that descended upon the Assyrian camp. The sound of their approach added to the confusion already spreading among the enemy. The Assyrians tried to fight back, but their fear overwhelmed them. They were leaderless and disorganized, and the sight of the Israelites charging with such confidence shook their spirits. The once mighty army, which had boasted of its strength, now scattered in every direction, desperate to save themselves. Judith's plan, inspired by God, was unfolding perfectly. The Assyrian soldiers abandoned their weapons and fled. Their camp, filled with supplies and treasures, was left undefended, and the Israelites seized everything. The people of Bethulia, who had been on the brink of surrender, now stood victorious. As the battle ended, the leaders of Bethulia gathered to honor Judith. She was hailed as a hero, a woman whose faith and courage had delivered her people. Judith, however, gave all the glory to God. "It is not by my hand that this victory was won," she said. "It is the Lord who has saved us. Let us give him thanks and praise, for his mercy endures forever." The people celebrated with joy, lifting their voices in songs of praise. They offered sacrifices and gave thanks to God for his deliverance. Judith's name was remembered throughout Israel as a symbol of faith and courage, and her story was passed down from generation to generation. The Assyrians, once so confident in their power, returned to their homeland in disgrace. Those who survived carried with them the memory of their defeat, a testimony to the power of the God of Israel. The Israelites, now free from the threat of invasion, returned to their cities and villages, their hearts filled with gratitude and faith. Judith herself returned to her home, content to live a quiet and peaceful life. She had fulfilled the mission God had given her, and her heart was at peace. The people of Israel continued to honor her, and her story became an inspiration to all who heard it. The fall of Holofernes was a reminder that no power on earth can stand against the will of God. Through the faith and courage of one woman, an entire nation was saved. Judith's story teaches us that even in the face of great danger, we must trust in God and stand firm in our faith. For with God, all things are possible, and his power is greater than any force that comes against us. The fall of Holofernes marked a turning point for the Israelites. It was not just a victory over an enemy army, but a victory of faith over fear, of trust in God over dependence on human strength. Judith's courage and wisdom remind us that God can use anyone, no matter their position or circumstance, to accomplish his purposes. The people of Bethulia never forgot the lessons of that day. They learned to trust in God even when the situation seemed hopeless. They saw that God's power is greater than any weapon or army, and that he is always with those who call on him in faith. The story of Judith continues to inspire us today. It reminds us that no matter how great the challenge, we can overcome it with God's help. Like Judith, we must trust in him, even when the odds seem impossible. For God is faithful, and he will never abandon his people. So let us remember the faith of Judith and the victory of Bethulia. Let us praise God for his mercy and strength and trust in him in all things. For he is our refuge and our deliverer, and with him we will always. Chapter 6. Victory for Israel. The Assyrian camp lay in chaos. News of Holofernes' death spread like wildfire, and with it came fear, confusion, and hopelessness among his soldiers. Their once great army, feared by nations, was now leaderless and scattered. The Israelites, led by their faith in God, had struck at the heart of their enemy. What seemed impossible just days before was now reality. God had delivered his people. As the sun rose over Bethulia, the Israelites gathered to give thanks to God for his mercy. The leaders of the city called the people together, and Judith stood among them, holding the head of Holofernes as a sign of God's victory. The people rejoiced, shouting praises to the Lord for hearing their prayers and saving them from destruction. Judith spoke to the crowd with wisdom and humility. Let us remember this day not as a victory of our strength, but as the triumph of our God. He has shown his power and delivered us from the hands of our enemies. All glory belongs to him. The people echoed her words, lifting their hands in prayer and thanksgiving. They knew that without Judith's courage and God's intervention, they would have perished. Now, with the Assyrians in disarray, it was time to act. The leaders of Bethulia organized their forces. Men from the city, strengthened by the victory God had already given them, prepared for battle. Word of Holofernes' death had spread to nearby Israelite towns, and reinforcements arrived to join the fight. It was not just the men who prepared. Everyone contributed to the effort, bringing food, weapons, and encouragement to the warriors. Judith, having done her part, stepped back to let the leaders and soldiers take charge. She returned to her home, her heart at peace, knowing that God's plan was unfolding. Though she was no longer on the battlefield, the people would always remember her as the one God used to deliver them. The Israelites moved swiftly, striking the Assyrian camp at dawn. The soldiers of Holofernes, disorganized and demoralized, were caught off guard. Many had already abandoned their posts and fled in fear, leaving behind their weapons, supplies, and treasures. Those who remained tried to fight, but without a leader, their efforts were futile. The Israelite army, fueled by their faith in God and their love for their people, overwhelmed the enemy. The battle was not a long one. The Assyrians, already broken in spirit, were defeated quickly. As they fled, the Israelites pursued them, driving them far from their land. The once mighty army of Holofernes, which had boasted of its power and threatened to destroy Israel, was no more. God had turned their strength into weakness and their pride into shame. When the battle was over, the Israelites returned to the Assyrian camp. There, they found an abundance of goods left behind by the fleeing soldiers. The camp was filled with gold, silver, fine clothes, and other treasures, as well as weapons and provisions. The people of Bethulia and the surrounding towns gathered the spoils, dividing them among themselves as a sign of God's blessing. The leaders of Bethulia ensured that everyone received their share of the spoils. They remembered Judith's warning to remain humble and give all glory to God. As they distributed the goods, they also set aside a portion to be offered to the Lord in thanksgiving. They knew that the victory and blessings they now enjoyed came from him alone. With the enemy defeated and the spoils gathered, the people turned their attention to celebrating God's deliverance. A great feast was prepared, and the entire city joined together to honor the Lord. They sang hymns of praise and offered sacrifices, lifting their voices in gratitude for his mercy and protection. Judith was honored as the hero of Bethulia, but she refused to take credit for the victory. She reminded the people that it was God who had delivered them, using her as his servant. "I am but a woman," she said, "yet the Lord chose me to carry out his will. Let us always trust in him, for he is our strength and our salvation." The feast continued for many days, with people coming from all over Israel to celebrate. They brought gifts and offerings, and they shared stories of God's faithfulness. The unity and joy among the people were a testament to the power of their faith and the greatness of their God. In the days that followed, peace returned to the land. The Israelites, no longer under the threat of the Assyrians, were able to rebuild their cities and live in safety. The memory of what God had done for them remained strong, and the story of Judith's courage was passed down from generation to generation. Judith herself returned to her quiet life in Bethulia. She lived many years in peace, loved and respected by her people. Though she never sought fame or recognition, her name became known throughout Israel as a symbol of faith, courage, and obedience to God. She remained steadfast in her devotion to the Lord, always pointing others to his power and goodness. The fall of Holofernes and the victory of Israel were remembered not just as a military triumph, but as a testament to the power of faith. It showed that even the greatest of enemies could be defeated when God is on the side of his people. The Israelites learned to trust in him, knowing that he is always faithful to those who call upon his name. This victory also served as a reminder of the importance of unity. The people of Israel came together in their time of need, supporting one another and standing strong in their faith. They learned that by working together and relying on God, they could overcome any challenge. The story of Judith and the victory of Bethulia continue to inspire us today. It teaches us that no matter how great the odds, we must trust in God and remain faithful to him. It reminds us that he can use anyone, no matter their position or strength, to accomplish his will. And it shows us that with God, all things are possible. Let us give thanks to the Lord for his mercy and his faithfulness. Let us remember the courage of Judith and the faith of the Israelites, who trusted in God and found victory. And let us always stand firm in our faith, knowing that the same God who delivered Israel is with us today. So the story ends with peace in the land and the name of God glorified. The people of Israel, once on the brink of destruction, were saved by the hand of God. And through Judith, his servant, they learned that faith, courage, and obedience can overcome even the greatest of challenges. For the Lord is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in trouble. Chapter 7. Judith's Legacy. After the great victory over the Assyrian army, the people of Israel returned to their homes, praising God for the deliverance he had provided. The fear and desperation that had once filled their hearts were now replaced with joy and peace. They had been saved from the brink of destruction, and their faith in God had been rewarded. But among them, one woman stood out, the one whom God had used to bring about this great victory. Her name was Judith. Judith had been a widow, living in a time of hardship and uncertainty, yet her faith and courage had made her the instrument of God's deliverance. She had not been a warrior or a soldier, but her trust in God was unwavering. It was this trust that had given her the strength to stand before the mighty Holofernes and strike a blow against the enemy. God had worked through her in a way that none had expected, and her bravery had turned the tide in favor of Israel. Now, as the people celebrated the victory, they also remembered Judith's role in it. She had risked her life, leaving the safety of her home to go into the enemy camp. She had shown no fear when she faced Holofernes, and her words and actions had been guided by God. It was clear to all that Judith was not just a woman of courage. She was a woman of faith, and it was her faith that had made her capable of doing what no one else had dared to do. The leaders of Israel knew that they owed much of their victory to Judith's courage. The great general Holofernes, who had planned to destroy them, had been slain by her hand. It was Judith who had cut off his head and brought it back to the people, showing them that God had delivered them from their enemy. Because of her, the Israelites had gained the upper hand, and the Assyrians had been forced to flee. As the days passed, Judith's fame spread far and wide. People from all over Israel came to see her and to hear her story. They came to thank her and to honor her for her bravery. But Judith remained humble. She gave all the glory to God, always pointing back to him as the true source of her strength. "It is not by my hand that this victory was won," she would say. "It is the Lord who has delivered us." Judith's humility was part of what made her such a powerful figure. She did not seek fame or recognition, and she did not want to be treated as a hero. Instead, she wanted to be remembered as a servant of God, one who had done her part in his plan. She knew that her actions had been guided by God's wisdom, and that she was simply a tool in his hands. The people of Israel recognized Judith's greatness, not just in the victory she had won, but in the way she lived her life. She had always been a woman of faith, even before the events that led to Holofernes' death. She had trusted God in all things, and her trust had never wavered. In her quiet, faithful life, she had been a model for others, showing them how to live with courage and conviction. Judith's legacy was not just one of victory over an enemy. It was a legacy of faith. She had shown the people that with God, anything is possible, and that courage comes from trusting in His power. Her story became a symbol of what it meant to be a faithful servant of God, and her example would continue to inspire generations to come. As time went on, the Israelites prospered. The land was peaceful once again, and the threat of the Assyrians was no more. But they did not forget the lessons they had learned through Judith's bravery. They remembered how she had stood up against the enemy when no one else would, and how her faith in God had led them to victory. They passed down her story to their children, teaching them to trust in God and to have courage in the face of adversity. Judith continued to live in her home in Bethulia, where she was respected and loved by all. She lived many years, and during that time, she remained a woman of prayer, devotion, and humility. She never sought attention or fame, but she always remained a shining example of faithfulness to God. Her life was a quiet testimony to the power of God working through those who trust in Him. Eventually, Judith passed away, but her legacy lived on. The people of Israel continued to honor her memory, and her story was told for generations. She became a symbol of what it means to live a life of faith, courage, and obedience to God. The story of Judith was not just a story of military victory. It was a story of the power of God to use anyone, no matter their station or position, to accomplish His purposes. Judith's legacy also reminded the people of Israel that God is always with them. Even when it seemed like all hope was lost, God had provided a way. He had used Judith's faith and courage to deliver His people, and He was still at work in their lives. The victory over the Assyrians was a testament to the fact that God could accomplish great things through those who trust in Him. For the Israelites, Judith's story was more than just a story of a woman's bravery. It was a reminder that God is faithful and that He will always provide for His people. Judith had shown them that no matter how big the challenge or how great the enemy, they could trust in God to deliver them. She had trusted in Him, and He had never failed her. Her story became a living testament to the faithfulness of God. The story of Judith also had an impact beyond Israel. It became a story of hope for all those who found themselves in difficult situations. Her courage and faith were an example to anyone who faced trials or challenges. She showed that it is possible to do great things when we trust in God, and that through Him, we can overcome any obstacle. As the years passed, the people of Israel continued to tell the story of Judith. They remembered her not just as a hero who had defeated an enemy, but as a woman whose life had been a testament to the power of God. They remembered her as someone who had lived out her faith in a way that inspired others to do the same. Her legacy was one of faith, courage, and obedience, and it continued to inspire generations. Judith's life reminds us that, no matter our circumstances, we can be used by God to accomplish His purposes. Like Judith, we can be faithful in small things, trusting that God will use us in big ways. Her legacy teaches us that courage is not about our own strength, but about trusting in God's power. And it reminds us that with God, nothing is impossible. Judith's story continues to speak to us today. It calls us to live lives of faith, to trust in God even when things seem impossible, and to have the courage to stand up for what is right. Like Judith, we can be part of God's plan to bring about His purposes in the world. All it takes is a heart that is willing to trust Him and obey His call. In the end, Judith's legacy was not just a matter of military victory. It was a matter of faith. And that is a legacy that will never fade, for the faithfulness of God. If you have enjoyed learning about the Bible and want to learn more about God's Word, check out our other videos here.